Hello, welcome to Journalism 2050. This is our podcast about the future of journalism and to some extent about the past of the future of journalism. And I could not be more thrilled to be joined by my dear friend and brilliant woman, Maria Bustillos, who you now describe yourself as an information activist, Maria, which is actually a pretty great description of what you do and what you're interested in. People who read CJR regularly will know that one of Maria's interests is in archiving and preservation of intellectual properties online. She's also a brilliant editor and writer, and in the last few years has been, I think, one of the pioneers of trying to figure out how to build and sustain owner-operated media entities. Is that the right way to describe?
Yeah.
Hydra and Popular and Brickhouse Media, which is your thing.
Yeah, the general thrust of it is to make sure that people can continue to publish freely without corporate constraints or outside constraints or political constraints as much as we possibly can. We live in the world and the world's full of constraints, but in the media environment that we're in now, we've obviously seen even further very powerful encroachments on people's ability to...
I'm going to stop you there because because we could now just go straight into all the constraints. But I also want to welcome into the studio Sam Earle, who is a Tow Research Fellow. He's also in the PhD Communications program here at Columbia, and he is a published author of a book called Tory Nation, which is about the Tory party, the Conservative Party in Britain, and just earlier on, I can't say when because we don't quite know when this is being published, but he's had recent fame on the internet because he published a guest essay in the New York Times about Nigel Farage and reform. And what happened, Sam? Do you want to tell us what it was about and then what kind of reception it got?
Yeah, well thank you for having me on, especially after the ignominy of the past week. I published an essay on Nigel Farage, as you said, about his rise within the UK, about what he's learned from Trump, campaigning with him, and just how he's become such a dominant figure within Britain. And some people liked it, some people didn't like it. We don't know what Ann Coulter thought of the actual piece, but she did share the headline with a photo of me and the caption, "Why all Nigel Farage's enemies so ugly?" Anyway, I've been spending a bit more time in the morning getting ready when I leave the house.
Just making yourself slightly less ugly.
Normally, normally a podcast would be a perfect place to come, but now even audio is video.
I did say to our producer Amanda, are we sure that we want Sam on, given the problem that he has with
Thank you for your bravery.
The aesthetics. That's
for standing by me.
Not all heroes wear capes. But actually, so in discussing this or in preparing for this episode and your arrival, Maria, because now you've exiled yourself to my homeland, or rather Scotland, which is almost my homeland, and Sam and I are both here in New York. So this is very much a transatlantic effort. What are you finding? What's your impression as you kind of come back and forwards?
I have a lot of family in California. I'm from California, and I hadn't been back to the States for a while. I think I expected things to look more different than they do. There's a weird air of normalcy until you have to produce a QR code to get into a building that I've walked into a million times without. There's these little hints of it about, but you read the newspaper. I mean, I have been kind of a little bit off grid because I'm here for a conference, and just being away from the news for a while really altered my sense of doom.
Calm.
A bit, yes. Yeah. I did feel a lot calmer because when you're putting all the pieces together, it really starts to look quite scary.
Well, before we get into the scary stuff, well, hopefully it's not just going to be scary stuff, it's also going to be about what we can do and how we can lean in to the moment and build things and emerge stronger. But we thought we'd go back. We're doing the Back to the Future part first off. And we were discussing Gawker media, actually, in preparation for this, because we were wanting to talk about independent media ownership and resilience. And for this part of the podcast, this is why I've invited Sam in, because we were talking about political constraint, what Gawker media was, and what happened to it. And Sam, you as you said, you sent me an email saying, I've fallen down the rabbit hole. So we do have some very young podcast listeners because it's a medium. So some people might not even know what Gawker is. So it was a news site set up by Nick Denton, who's a very talented journalist who came out of actually the Financial Times of all places, and who wanted to do things differently. Is that fair, Maria? Is that how would you describe Gawker?
He wanted a gossip site originally. Right. I've heard him say many times that like the interesting conversations were taking place off the page, that what journalists were talking about among themselves was more interesting. And so that was the seed of it.
He did actually he said that about the Financial Times as well, which is you would write these very straight stories about what was happening in banking, and then you'd go to the pub with all of your colleagues afterwards and you would hear all the interesting stories, and he would think that's what needs to be on the page. And in some ways it was quite a sort of a visionary idea of how journalism should work. I mean, you could say, well, it's just traditional muckraking.
Well, I think it seemed to embody two separate forces. One was, it very much felt like Nick Denton was importing a genre of journalism that's kind of more popular in Britain to the US, where in Britain the tabloids are very influential, very irreverent. They're proudly creatures of the gutter, and they want to bring the rich and powerful and celebrities down into the gutter with them. And then the second cultural force it really channeled was the rise of blogging and the kind of spirit, the horizontal spirit of the early internet, where it had this kind of casual, conversational, irreverent tone, and it was often funny, sometimes cruel, very ironic. And the other like philosophy that underpinned it, which was also at the heart of Silicon Valley, was this idea that information should be free and that everything should be public, everything should be known. And one of the ironies in a way is that it turns that against Silicon Valley itself. One of its favorite beats is on Silicon Valley, mocking Silicon Valley.
Valley-wag, actually, which is exactly where the seeds of the end of Gawker. Maria, I hope we're not triggering you too much.
No, I'm loving it. It's like these are good memories for me. There was a lot of wonderful writing there. I always blame the whole entire mess on Sam Biddle myself, because he was so mean and so funny about Peter Thiel, like over and over and over, like the most vicious, hilarious barbs, And so it's always been my suspicion that Peter Thiel went after this organization because they kind of got him,
Yeah, well, I think he's basically on the record saying as much. As slightly, there's questions over whether it was like the most controversial piece they published about Thiel was the one that disclosed to the public for the first time that he was gay. His sexuality wasn't a secret in his circles, but it was the first time that it had been publicly announced. And I think the other thing that's interesting with that is that Thiel said it wasn't the piece that really got under his skin. It was a comment underneath it from Nick Denton, who's also gay. And he commented on this piece outing Thiel, saying, now the only question that's left is why was Thiel so paranoid about this coming out? And I think this idea of him becoming, like his sort of character being questioned really did, eventually evolve into this incredible vendetta that lasted 10 years and was also a foreshadowing of the kind of rise of the tech mogul to clamp down on speech.
I think Gawker is just that really interesting example, because I think before the Gawker trial, and Maria, correct me if I'm wrong here, independents particularly in the American market, always seem to only rely on your commercial viability. So in other words, the idea that something would come along and shut you down, it feels as though McCarthyism was maybe an era where that wasn't true, but there was a kind of possibly completely false sense that you could publish very freely in the United States and be protected by the First Amendment, and as long as you were making money, everything would be all right. But Gawker seemed to change all of that. Am I overstating that?
Well, there was one enemy. This guy spent a lot of money, taking them down. It was one lawsuit after another. The A.J. Delario lawsuit was not the first one. And they kept winning and winning. And in fact, they would have won if they had been permitted to appeal, even the one that they lost, But it was just going to keep coming. It was just going to, this guy was going to keep suing them until he shut it down, and he did.
So to go back to the specifics of the case, because again, it's actually quite a long time ago now. It's approaching
10 years almost.
Well, it's approaching 10 years since the trial, but it's actually longer since the original. So the original story that triggered triggered the trial was a weird kind of nothing piece of gossip, really, about Hulk Hogan, who was a wrestler.
Yeah. So Thiel, he decides that he wants to take revenge on Gawker, and with the help of an associate, they kind of come up with this plan that they're just going to prowl the Gawker archive, but also be on the lookout for any news stories that might be able to become the substance for a case against Gawker that could then crush them. And it takes almost 5 years for that moment to arrive in the form of a leaked sex tape of Hulk Hogan, the WWE wrestler, and it was recorded without his consent. There had been rumors of it before. Gawker, it finds its way to Gawker, and they publish it. Hulk Hogan's not happy. Peter Thiel's team see that, and they decide this is perfect for us because it's not about the First Amendment. They make it about
it's about privacy. Or privacy.
Yeah.
Privacy, as we're in America.
Yeah, and even while they're pursuing that case, they're still pursuing other ones because they don't know that that's the one that will win for them.
And at the time, Maria, it wasn't known that Peter Thiel, who even then he was wealthy as a founder of PayPal, part of what's known as the PayPal Mafia, which has a lot of the original money, if you like, that has gone into other Silicon Valley companies. But now he's centre of the Trump advisory shadow cabinet. He's the founder of Palantir. I mean, lots of things now that we know about Peter Thiel, but he really wasn't known at the time at all, was he? Outside, I would say, the Gawker circle, he wasn't like. It's not like Elon Musk is now a media figure in his own right. This sort of was there any? So what happened in terms of him revealing himself? How did the trial? Because at trial you didn't know that he was financing it. Is that right?
We all suspected that there was. I mean, it was pretty obvious that there were two teams of lawyers. There were these really sleek, well-dressed ones and like properly tailored suits, and then there were these like Florida wackadoodles who were just in a completely different league. It looked like guys that you'd see on the back of a bus to call this number for your accident, and we were like, these are what's happening, and so it was like who's involved, and there were many names mentioned, and Thiel's was one of them, that somebody would be backing this whole thing, but there was not a proper understanding that it was possible that somebody was willing to spend that many, like tens of millions of dollars by the end to achieve this. And so what happened was, after the verdict and after the judge, through some shenanigans, made it impossible for the appeal to happen because of filing dates and all these bizarre little twists and turns, about, I want to say several weeks went by before we knew. And then I can't remember who revealed it first, but pretty soon after that, Thiel himself wrote an op-ed, I think in the Times, saying that this was one of the better philanthropic things that he'd done. He called it a philanthropic, thing, and that these people, were evil, that they were going after people and damaging their lives. And it's like, excuse me, you just put like however many hundreds of people out of work. It's like, dude, I mean, anyway.
And you managed to get in to cover the trial every day? Is that right? Yeah. How did you achieve that apart from just turning up?
I really wanted to do it, and so I called a couple of editors and had a few conversations, and then a guy, Brian Abrams, who was editing Death and Taxes in those days, that was kind of affiliated with like Spin and Billboard, that whole group. So I said, yeah, let's do it, And they spent some money on it, and like I went every day and filed every day, and then I had like a sort of wind up piece. But what I found really it changed my whole trajectory professionally. That one experience is the formative moment of my career.
Explain that a bit.
Well, because we did not know what we were looking at, and it had become evident that one person who didn't like what was being written about him for whatever reason could just spend a lot of money and deprive millions of people of whatever reading they wanted and end all these livelihoods. And this had been done through a particular sort of attack against the wealth of one guy, of Nick Denton. He was very much the owner of this thing, and it was his millions that were gone after personally. It wasn't a question of like, the money wasn't spread out. It was just one guy's. And so that determined so much about what happened. It was a vulnerable spot. And so I determined right after that to do everything I could to increase and create opportunities for people to practice journalism in an atmosphere where that would not be possible, to sort of fortify the sources of information for people. And so that's what I've done ever since I started cooperatives. I involved myself in the library world a certain amount, archiving. I have done work with the Internet Archive, and practically everything I do is like a question of protecting information freedom.
It's really interesting. We were talking to Jay Rosen for another episode of this, and Jay was talking about his essay that he wrote in 2016 after the first Trump victory, which was called Winter is Coming, where he listed a lot of forces that were going to be difficult to navigate. And he lays it out as an attack on every part of the knowledge economy. It's interesting to see politics as a force in that, because again it felt as though a lot of the knowledge economy was already sort of under attack by just Silicon Valley's business model. A lot of our work at the Tower Centre is around how platforms are just have for a long time been essentially hostile platforms for hosting journalism, and yet we were all cleaving to Google and cleaving to Facebook and, please kind of develop tools so we can put more of our stuff on your platforms. What's the kind of, again, sort of it feels like this is a really important inflection point.
Yeah, well, I think what it illuminates is that social media and the internet, it created two threats to journalism, and we often talk about one slights the neglect of the other, and the one that's well known is that it completely destroyed the financial basis for journalism, the old model of advertising and print and the classifieds. But then the other threat is that the internet created some incredibly wealthy people that were completely unaccountable democratically. And we see that now with Elon Musk. But Peter Thiel against Gawker was the first time, I think, that we really saw that, where you had someone who had made their vast sums of wealth in tech, and he was going to use that wealth to literally crush the media, not through a backhanded way of their technologies undoing the foundations of journalism, like a full-on frontal assault on media. And so it created those two threats, and I think we're still in the wreckage of them.
Well, I don't know that you want to say that it was a full on obvious. He's very sneaky and very bullying, and that's the kind of character that Silicon Valley or the VC sort of ethos and mentality of like you raise this money and you just rapaciously grab whatever isn't tied down.
I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna make myself very unpopular by being, if you like, devil's advocate here and say everything that you've both said I can strongly relate to. The implosion in the 2010s, of which Gawker was part, was preceded by a period in which there was a generalised feeling that the press or journalists who had any kind of power at all had gone too far, because it ran parallel to the hacking trial in the UK. So Nick Davis's story actually wasn't really the trial, but Nick Davis's stories for The Guardian about phone hacking in the UK started to break in sort of 2006, 2007. Nobody paid any attention to them. There were 3 or 4 years of people trying to suppress them, other outlets not covering them. And it sort of revolved around this privacy of like, we're going into a surveillance age, and journalists are using the technologies of surveillance to do their own kind of bullying and squeezing. And so there are a lot of people I know who probably don't feel quite the same as Maria and I do about Gawker, but were like, well, good, they had it coming. They
so
stepped
many.
over a line. Yeah.
I wrote an op-ed in the LA Times. You're making a mistake. Gawker is good. And it's important that there should be mistakes and that you own up to them. There's been a lot of scandals at the New York Times. There's been, the glass scandal. There's millions of them. Stories that were
WMDs.
Yeah.
Fabricated stories.
And did you shut the paper down? Because no, you didn't. You'd own up.
Mm-hmm.
You correct. You print the correction. We know how this thing's supposed to work.
Well, but this is why Peter Thiel's team was so delighted to find this case, because they knew actually it's quite hard to defend the media on the grounds of publishing a sex tape. It's not what anyone's image of journalism is supposed to be. The irony that barely needs stating is that Peter Thiel makes a very unpersuasive advocate for privacy when he founded Palantir, which sells surveillance technologies to states. And, this was... He did cast this fight against Gawker as a fight for freedom. He literally repeatedly referred to Gawker as a terrorist organization, as the Al-Qaeda of Silicon Valley. And someone went, are you sure about that? And he went, yes, because they instill a culture of fear and conformity in Silicon Valley. And we need everyone to be brave and fearless about what people are, how people are judging us.
It's so interesting because now we've got a time when the words terrorist organisation are being appropriated by his protégés, Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance, to describe other media organisations, including another one that we're associated, The Nation, ran Elizabeth Spear's article about Charlie Kirk. And the first thing was J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller said, this kind of coverage is terrible, and the organisations that support this kind of coverage are terroristic, mentions foundations, etc. And it's that through line, as you say, sort of I'd completely forgotten that Thiel had used.
Free speech as long as you say what I want.
Right, and then also the extremity of if you don't do that, it's terrorism, which is
it's if you don't do that, I will exert myself to shut you down. And so you should be scared to say what you think is true. I mean, we're seeing this everywhere. I just got back from this conference about digital librarianship, and there's so much censorship and political pressure and book bannings, and the stories you're hearing from all over the U.S., about how this effort has ramped up and failed most of the time, but it has to be fought. And I see it kind of as one sort of effort to crush everything that doesn't conform to their sort of view of the world. You're supposed to like if you don't like Elon Musk, you're going to be in trouble on Twitter. It's really strange to think about that this man who actually went in a building carrying a porcelain sink demands admiration every day in the most incomprehensibly childish manner. And yet, we all used to go on Twitter and be able to talk to people all over the world, and now you kind of can't. It's like truly been ruined.
Well, I think that's like another thing that the Gawker felt so resonant right now is this idea that something about social media means that it's not enough just to be really rich. You also want to be liked.
Yeah.
And so Elon Musk, he doesn't want to just be the richest man in the world. He also wants people to find him funny.
He's desperate
he's
for
desperate.
the thing that he'll never, ever achieve. It's incredible to watch the most profoundly unfunny man trying so hard to post.
Yeah.
He wants to be a poster in the worst way, the one thing that you can't buy. And these like really roguish lunatics at Gawker who are like the posters of all time and are all broke as church mice, but like post like crazy. You know, it's an incredible...
And are funny.
And are hilarious. Yeah. And, you know, barbs that sting every time. It's like, it's an incredible battle to watch.
Yeah.
So as you say, Maria, this changed the trajectory of your work and what you think about putting together. So tell us a little bit about how, from your perspective, you know, the post-Gawker world. So I kind of feel like this is the J. Rose and Winter is Coming moment of 2016. And there, again, it's so easy to forget or be ahistoric about these things, which is that I had to remind myself that the conclusion of the Gawker trial, the closure of Gawker, first Trump presidency, the Russian advertising that was spread all over Facebook and targeted at American voters during 2015, 2016, revealed in 2017. All of these things were happening in actually a very compressed period of time, or all coming to a head at very compressed periods of time.
That's right.
And now, here we are, 10 years on. What's happened? What's happened that should make us feel better or worse?
Well, a lot of things have happened on both sides of that ledger. I mean, in 2016, 17, by then I had already been covering cryptocurrency and Bitcoin for a couple of years, first at the New Yorker. And I knew this was going to be a really cool thing because it is, to me, a method of creating tamper-proof records. And it still is that. I mean, it's been overtaken by the worst people in the universe. But I was really thinking it would be a great thing to be able to harness this to create bulletproof records of archives. And I had been, I started to write down, talk to people, and I got this phone call in like late 2016, early 2017, I guess. These guys were trying to make a blockchain-based publishing platform. And a bunch of us got together. It was called Civil, and it was funded by Joe Lubin, the founder of Ethereum. And in those days, like Ethereum, it was a very big deal. They had a lot of money, and all of this, but the regulatory frameworks were very wobbly. And so the price of Ethereum went from about $1,500, it didn't quite reach, to down to 67. And so the money dried up for a lot of these like really interesting experiments. Anyway, we founded this publishing platform at a time when I could see that legacy media was going to be crippled by these same kinds of efforts. The pressure was increasing. The guys who went after Gawker were emboldened by the ability to sort of weaponize lawsuits, like the lawfare became insane, and it was obviously going to continue. But I thought if we created our own organizations with sort of novel forms of ownership that were proof against this type of attack, and kind of like batten down the hatches a bit, at least we could demonstrate better ways of protecting press freedom. And so I think in a lot of ways we've been successful.
Right. Because we actually met because of Civil, because it was a failed project that we were both involved in on other sides, because I was kind of part of a group of people who were not doing anything interesting or revolutionary like you were, but we were the nerds who were asked to figure out what does it look like to have a constitution that people can sign up to.
It was great, actually. You did really interesting work.
But it always sort of strikes me that it was kind of this far. Like, it was a really great idea or instinct, just as you say, not at the wrong time, running maybe not quite the right way, with the wrong underpinnings in it. But in the way that people say, well, you know, failure is actually great in innovation. I mean, publishing is not great. People are very judgmental about failure. But it was, I sort of feel that, as you say, that there was something, I'm interested to hear you say, in some ways we really succeeded. So unpack that a bit for us.
We made a cooperative, and it was 9 publishers to start with, and it was called the Brick House Cooperative, and there were people all over the world, because I always felt like, okay, here's these people giving me money, not enough to have, I didn't have the kind of editorial experience to make a big publication anyway, but they were all, you know, they wanted guinea pigs for this, and I was like, great, I'll do that. So what was I going to do that would be interesting, that would add to the conversation? And I always felt that the weakness, the most profound weakness in U.S. journalism was its insularity and its refusal to sort of hire people who understood things as residents, you know, the whole tendency to parachute in and, you know, create all kinds of misunderstandings about things that were happening in distant countries. So the first thing I did was get all my colleagues to go looking for the most interesting blogs that they could find that were Anglophone blogs, but written outside. And we are still publishing, like I've been publishing Brian Yu, who is in Taiwan since 2018. And I mean, he's like, you know, a big deal now. And he's, you know, we've helped create like some opportunities for people. Kola Tubosun is a Nigerian linguist, really freaking gifted. Yemisi Aribisala, you know, we've given a space for people to publish what they want. And it's been incredible. And it's tiny. You know, it's this little petri dish, but I think when people come and read Flaming Hydra, which is what it eventually became, and it's now like about 60 people, and, you know, they all share the revenues. It's very little revenues, but like it's a really fun hobby. It's a light lift for everybody, and they're able to write whatever they want, and the results are profoundly different from the sort of like deracinated, you know, bloodless kind of boring AI slop type nonsense, chum-filled. It's like when there's real people talking. I kind of want to go back to one thing that you said, Sam, about like what was missing, you know, and I think there's been tension, and Jay Rosen has written about this too, about the view from nowhere, and how the idea in like the idealized journalist was the one who was completely dispassionate. Mm-hmm. This is what the blogging era changed. The blogging era was like all voice, and it was, you knew exactly, you could triangulate, like if I say something and you know who I am and where I live and what I think, then you can figure out what I'm saying better. It's a very different approach, but it's also really valuable. And I think that the real strength of these years since has been to rehumanize, or to give people a sense that we want to be talking to people. We want to know people, and we want to know what they think. And I think that that's just an unbeatable, unsilenceable, powerful way of approaching informing the public.
So Maria's painting this very, I think, optimistic picture that I would like to buy into. As you know, we don't like just to have optimism. So do you, from your perspective as a scholar of these kinds of things, do you think that there is reason to be hopeful about these things on the fringes, or are you a bit worried about the mass?
I am more worried than hopeful is how I describe my, you know, internal balance. I think that, you know, in my research, I'm interested in the idea, that optimism that came with the early internet, and then what happened in the next decade, and you know, the way we I'm trying to look at it through the angle of the concept of crowds. And with the rise of the internet and the rise of social media, you had more optimism around what crowds can do than ever before. There was all this talk about smart mobs, the wisdom of crowds, crowdsourcing, organizing without organizations. And then something happened over the course of 5 to 10 years that really does span the Gawker trial, I think, about 2007 to 2016, where that optimism about the internet disappears. And we still talk about the internet in crowds, but we've kind of reverted to the more familiar perception of crowds as easy to manipulate, emotional, the social media mob, witch hunts.
Sort of destructive rather than constructive, which
is
is not how it would be viewed across the political spectrum. So there'll be lots of people who are not sitting in this studio who would say, but it has been a hugely positive force. People are getting their voices heard, etc. But that, I don't know, that feeling of manipulation or the higher power, I think, is
and I think what's really tricky now is how, like, I think, you know, I don't want to overstate my thesis that Gawker opened the gates of hell and now we're in on the other side and kind of stuck there. But I think there was something in the Gawker trial where you had this, Gawker represented East Coast elites and Hulk Hogan represented real America, and real America won, and it was only later that you realized that real America was being funded and sponsored and really weaponized by a tech billionaire for his own personal vendetta. And I think that coalition between Thiel and Hogan really does capture Trumpism, and it is really powerful. It is a really difficult thing to unseat.
You don't even have to, Thiel doesn't even have to enter into it. One of the pieces that I wrote for Death and Taxes actually blew my own mind when I went and looked back.
Yeah, Hogan as Trump. Yeah.
You wrote that piece?
At the time. Yeah.
It's like, I think it was called like Hulk Hogan is the Donald Trump of sports or something like this. And it was like, here are these two people who just want to be in the public eye at any price. You know, incredibly vulgar, misogynistic men who make a virtue of their own barbarity. And it's a very similar flavor. And somehow around that time, Hulk Hogan had been asked, and he said, I'd like to be his running mate. And I'm like, oh, that'll be great. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Will probably be better than some of the other people he could have picked. But also the whole kayfabe and professional wrestling. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. And the confusion that caused, which is, these are not really, this person seems aggressive and menacing, but actually it's a bit of a laugh. It's a joke. It's not real. And it was Thiel who said about Donald Trump, take him seriously, but not literally, I think. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's like that the Hogan case, it showed it's not, and like Hogan can't win on his own. And Trump couldn't win on his own. They need these other financial interests to be entangled with them for real America, quote unquote, to win. But, you know, even according to Thiel's close friends, without the Gawker trial and what it showed him about this resentment towards smug East Coast liberals, he wouldn't have gotten behind Trump so early. And, you know, fast forward to Trump being president, Thiel's then at the conference that same year giving a speech, and then fast forward another 8 years and Hulk Hogan is giving a speech to the RNC in 2024 wearing a real American shirt with a picture of himself, which he then rips off to reveal the Trump advance t-shirt. And I mean, with that image alone, it's hard to be optimistic about the future.
I think these are not mutually exclusive positions, and I definitely am ping-ponging between mine and yours all the time. Like, it's terrible watching some of the people who I think are the worst people in the world, literally, you know, kind of getting their way and silencing everybody, and it's horrible. But then, you know, no kings. Mm-hmm. And I mean, a lot of people were afraid to go out, you know, but once they got out there, and there was a lot about this at Flaming Hydra, our cooperative publication, where people were like, I don't know what it's going to be like, and we might get attacked or tear gassed or crazy stuff might happen. And we got out and they were like, everyone's out here. We're all together. This is so incredible. We all feel the same. You know, there's a huge number of people who want things to be better and have maybe the means to, start making it so. And I think these things are happening simultaneously.
I agree with that. I don't want to be a complete doom monger, because I also think that when you look back at the optimism of the early internet, it was filled with illusions and all this innocence. And at least now I think we know what we're up against, we know where we stand, and I think that has allowed us a greater clarity of mind for going forward.
Sam, thanks so much. I was going to say back to your research duties, but that was a great conversation. And now we're going to bring in Maureen Doux, our friend who's also at the Town Centre at the moment, and just to talk about the nitty-gritty of business ownership and development and independence in a slightly different form. But thanks very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Sam, you're very handsome.
Handsome.
You hear that, Ann Coulter?
Handsome Sam Earle, as we like to
Sam.
call him.
It begins now. It begins now.
So we've lost Sam, but we've gained another member of the, a visiting member of the Town Centre, which is our visiting scholar, Maureen Doux. Maureen, welcome. Welcome
Thank
to
you.
America.
Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Well, apparently you're allowed in for now. And Maureen, actually, it turns out that Maureen and I knew each other anyway. But I knew Maureen's work through. I know that I'm going to get the pronunciation of it wrong, so you can pronounce it.
Médianes.
Oh, you see, I was going to say Médianes.
Yeah,
Médianes.
Médianes. Yeah.
Médianes. There we go. And which is it's an agency, right, which supports and looks for new ways of finding sort of sustainable models for the kind of thing that Maria was talking about, really, sort of independent media. Can you talk a bit about? But you're in France, but also looking across Europe. So I thought it'd be fun in this segment, fun in inverted commas, just to talk about some of the sort of the challenges in those models. I think Maria's framed it really well as being, this is actually now really super important that we get these kind of sustainable things. I think, for a lot of my recent career, people were like, we have to find a new business model for journalism. And I was like, well, there are business models, but they're not the business models which are going to make you cajillions of dollars, etc. So tell me what's going on at Médianes and how the picture is different maybe in Europe to America.
Actually, we launched 5 years ago now. We're both a media outlet, an agency, and a peer network, because we wanted to help the media leaders, new media, or establish legacy media to be more independent, but not only, as you say, on the financial side or on the editorial side, but also on the technical side, how you can really be independent. And we created this in France because in France there is a super concentrated media ecosystem, 10 billionaires clearly own the news. So there was something that we really wanted to help the media leaders to think not only on the business model but also how they can be really independent on the long run, because I think independence, it's something that you build. It's not something that is a stage that you can go one day and it's great. And what is really interesting, it's since some years now we're more operating in Europe, because I think we actually acknowledge that media leaders in Europe share the same issues, problematic, and especially I think compared to America or sometimes we were talking about Silicon Valley, we have the same issues, but we have sometimes a different point of view of what we want, especially on privacy and what kind of tools we want to use. So it's a special moment right now in Europe.
So that is interesting. There's something that we talk about a little bit in our work at Columbia, which is this media. In some ways, we've catastrophized for so long about the consolidation of power, and particularly in distribution and technical power, that I think when all the things that we were predicting, so if you're an academic or a media columnist, and I've been a bit of both, when you predict Facebook is going to be really terrible for journalism, and it turns out to actually be true, you sometimes slightly surprise yourself and you're like, I didn't realise that. I knew it was going to be terrible, I didn't know it was going to be this terrible. And as you say, you're at a sort of an inflection point and Europe sort of got there a bit earlier, I think, because it doesn't have the same financial interest in being dominated by American companies that America has in dominating Europe. And is there the same? I would say, Maria, that there's a kind of an existential crisis here right now about ownership and independence, and we've seen it with the purchase of Paramount by Skydance, which is ultimately owned by David Ellison. Larry Ellison is the founder of Oracle, and just recently bought the Free Press, a blogging platform, I don't know, it's like the Huffington Post, yes, exactly, who knows. Barry Weiss, who, late of this parish, is now the editor-in-chief of CBS News. It's all being sort of brought under this one entity. In Europe, is there any, this has happened, so the playbook for a lot of this consolidation comes from parts of Europe, right? It comes from Hungary. Rupert Murdoch had a lock on a lot of UK media a long time, like in way in excess in terms of market share to anything that's currently happening in the US. But does Europe feel that existential threat in the same way that America does at the moment, do we think?
I think we feel like the threat because there's been like a kind of I think a big moment, especially last year in France, because of like the electoral, like the new local and municipal election that have been like the far right again super high in France. And I think like media started to realize that we were like only 2 years before like the next presidential election, and that something could happen again in France. And what is not funny, because I will say what is funny is like people also realized in France that we weren't only alone like in this kind of situation with like big like individuals, super rich individuals like coming up like on national TV, like radio, but also like book publishing house, like just coming. And we co-founded like a European network named Sfera, and we have like Italian partners, Hungarian partners, and also partners in France. And right now what's happening in Hungary, what's happening in Italy, we actually able to share this kind of story, like, oh, this coming this way, or like from the private sector or from the public sector. And what you can see is like there's already like some kind of like sound, like a slow censorship, because people starting to, I think, to be afraid, but also because France always look up like from like the other side of the Atlantic, and we see what's coming, and we can see like what could happen in France. So I think like people are already like in a more building mode, like what can we do? So people are actually starting to talk between like other newsrooms, but not only in France, also like in Europe. And so I'm like more on the optimist side right now, but I think that the path is so long. We need to like create so much things, especially more on the legal like side of thing, and like more cooperative models. So people are starting to build something, but it's taking so much time.
So this is where we go from looking at the last 25 years to looking at the next. 25 years is a long time. I'm fairly confident you're still going to be around, Maureen. I'm fairly sure that I'd be very surprised if I was still around at that point.
We'll still be croaking out our upper Sioux.
We will. We'll still be complaining about things from somewhere.
We will.
But I think that's a point about building and what's needed and the length of the road is such a good one. So what are the things that we're going to need for the next 25 years, or what would you ideally like?
I like my Christmas list for the media.
Christmas
exactly.
For the
media.
Holiday list.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we have to think like the independence on like editorial, financial, and technical kind of view. So I think first like is audience-led model. Like I truly believe in like subscription, donation, membership. There's like plenty of ways like to implement this, but also I think it's a better way to also to work with the audience, like to think about the audience every day. Secondly, I think it's like to cooperative model. I truly believe like in this. So when I was listening to you, I was like, yes, this is actually what we need. And I think there's a common mistake to think that it can only be used or like implement for small newsroom. It is not. Like one of our partner, like in Spain, like El Salto, that's a big newsroom right now. And I think it's truly like that needs some like organization and some rules, but it can really works. And I think like the last part would be like to have like more mutual infrastructures, like more mutual, like to share more resources between newsroom, NGOs, sometimes institution, because if you try something, the first time you're not going to succeed. So if you can hear from others, like you were talking about civil, like just before, like for me, like it's normal to fail at first, like it's like the whole entrepreneurial thing. But when you already fail, you can help like someone else. So in the newsroom industry, I think if we talk like a little more, that is like something that we can be proud of. And especially I think in this moment, like the real opponents are not like in the media industry. Most of the time it's like outside the media industry. So even if you're like Le Monde is talking to the New York Times and the New York Times is talking to Mediapart, like I think it's going to be like easier for us to find ways, especially like more on the legal terms sometimes, like to think of ways to be more independent, like broadly.
What about you, Maria? What are the things, the pre-existing conditions for where we want to get to?
I think the most important thing is to get people to realize that journalism can't be just a business. It is a public trust, and it needs to be protected and understood in that way. And when people spend money on it, I mean, this is a terrible weapon that's been used against the media by moneyed interests and corporate interests that want to control what's being said or what can be said. But I think people are seeing with the deterioration, like people my age for sure, are seeing the deterioration of what's available to them to be able to find out or learn about the quality of libraries and archiving, everything from that to like what the news looks like. I mean, I looked at the AP News this morning and it was just weird, you know? It looked like a cereal box. It's like there's no imperative to educate the public as like that would be the first, you know, value for a healthy society, to have an educated, informed public. It seems like the most obvious thing, but that's not what anybody leads with. So that would be like my first thing. The second one is we need to communicate to people that digital ownership rights are of paramount importance, and there's not enough emphasis being put on this because so much has disappeared that I published, you know, which is very important, obviously, that should be all found and restored. But like all my colleagues, you know, so many people, you look and it's like it's gone. How are we going to learn that you can't build a future without the past? And they're concerted. It's much easier to manipulate dumb people. And so there's not an imperative to teach them. And so that's my other thing.
I think that's so interesting, and we leave it behind when we talk about definitions of journalism or the future of journalism, and when you have to write down or describe or talk to students about what is your essential job. Archiving, preservation of what happened even like 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago, and who actually keeps records of what's going on now. I think a lot of us didn't exactly grow up, but again, it was a delusion of the first round of the internet that this would be something where you'd be able to find everything forever. And it wasn't until I had a car ride, so again, terrible name dropping, I was going to a book festival and we picked up from the airport, and my car ride mate was the historian Anthony Beevor, who is a great kind of figure in British historical writing. And it's one of those things where I say to him, what are you doing? He says, I'm working on a history of the Second World War. And what are you doing? And I'm like, well, I'm doing some podcasting at The Guardian. But we got into a very interesting conversation about it, and he said, the internet is the worst thing that ever happened to historians. And I was like, but that can't be right, because actually there's so much social history, there's so much. And he said, no, but there's nothing's reliable, everything is fungible, everything can be erased or manipulated or whatever. And like, you know, if you're a historian and you go to a certain place at a certain time and you find, you know, the artifact, you know, if you're an archaeologist, you find the artifact, you're a historian, you find the papers, you know where you are. And it was the first time that I had that oh shit moment of, yeah, of course, it's completely right.
Well, on the other hand, there's Rooster Kale and the Internet Archive.
Brewster Kale, the Internet Archive. Well, you've been very involved with that, and that's an interesting thing to look forward to, because almost like Wikipedia as well, we've seen some of these collective and almost cooperative enterprises.
Wikipedia is so important. And I mean,
Right.
Wikipedia is better than any encyclopedia that ever existed previously because you can see the history of a dispute.
Right.
And that is it's incorruptible.
Yeah.
It's an incorruptible record of every single thing that's happened, and you could record it and download it and look at it and prove to yourself, to your own satisfaction, that something really did happen.
And the Internet Archive is something we use literally all the time, both in our classroom and in our research, because it's the only place that you can find things, and yet it's actually largely, it's I think, held together, as somebody once said, by, kind of good prayers and string. It's not funded in the same way that lots of corporate entities might be funded, and yet it's so important. And we see now, I think there was a piece the other day in Nieman Lab about how there were holes opening up because of the way that AI crawlers now work on the web, and blocking has become something that you need to do sometimes to stop people from stealing everything that you own. But at the same time, it's also kind of detrimental to things like archives.
I was in Canada when there was that terrible DDoS attack against the archive. I happened to be interviewing Brewster Kahle right then because I'm very interested in his approach to these things, and I'm working on a little chapbook about his views. And watching that team work on that attack was really instructive to me. Like, you don't actually really think about who is fortifying the wall, but there's guys up at every corner of the globe in the middle of the night, all pouring water on that fire. And it was really fascinating to watch the dedication, of these people. That a lot of people working on it who understand very well what the importance of it is.
And this kind of sort of relates to your point, Maureen, about the infrastructure that we need is not necessarily within each media company. What can we do about that? Because I sort of feel like when it's 4 people or 5 people and getting going with a newsroom, we've seen some amazing successes, I think, with that. What about the bigger infrastructure picture? So sort of archive is one part. What are other things that and how do you see any good things happening?
I think there's a good moment in Europe right now, on this kind of we need to not think only on a newsroom level, but multiple newsroom, because even sometimes when you want to create a new infrastructure, it's hard what to say. It's it's always easy for you to say okay, I cannot buy this new tool or this new CMS. So sometimes it's when you think you can be multiple on a different project, it's easier. And what is interesting right now, for example, in France, there's new kind of portals for news, the kind of Google News or Netflix, but for news, but on a small or medium level, several newsrooms coming out together saying hey, if you want to have multiple subscription, maybe you can have just one, but you have multiple access. You have also another project named Portail des médias indépendants, so the independent media portals, and they are it's a Google News, but only with more social justice, ecological, independent media news, and you can have all of this on the same webpage. And I think this couldn't have happened years ago, but now it's common sense. Yes, obviously we need this kind of project. And right now, what is interesting is I think we already passed the moment that we realize that we need to cooperate on, for example, investigative journalists. You can have great example of investigative pace or kind of network that's going to work on the same editorial work. So this is okay. But I think now journalists, they acknowledge that they can share values, that they share vision, editorial vision. So I think if you have this, that's the common ground. What is more difficult, and it's when you're going to talk about marketing and data and even administrative stuff. So usually it's easier because it's non-editorial. So people sometimes in the newsroom are okay, this we can share.
Yeah, fine, you do that, yeah.
But actually, when you go to the marketing team, they're no, we're not going to share that because this is the core of the newsroom, so the core of the model. But what we can see now, in Europe, is there are more and more people that want to share some kind of tool, some kind of even people that can work between 2 newsrooms just to be in the new non-editorial thing. So for me, I think it's pretty new. People are still trying to say, hey, how we can build something different And for me, what is interesting is like the cooperative model, I think, is the solution, because when it's like, when you know that you have a part of like a common project, it's more easy to say like, oh, I'm not going to get, I don't know, like to have issues, or I'm not going to be the one left in the room without nothing. So if everyone has a place at the same table, I think it's easier to think that.
This goes back to what Emily did at Civil. And I think one of the things that I learned, that I have had the most occasion to remember since those days, is there were a bunch of people that came in at the end because they were trying to save it at all costs. And they were like letting every Tom, Dick, and Harry, like, you know, and breaking their own rules to let completely unproven newsrooms full of people who we didn't know. There were like all these, anyway, it was a mess. And the rules were really good. And I think those should be published on an open source basis.
It was, when you say me, that was not actually just me. There was like really smart lawyers who, and other kind of... But it was that thing of collective thinking around what does it take to create a constitution or a set of standards that everybody can sign up to, that you have to meet to participate. You know, like what is the price of entry to participation? And it's really fascinating to me how that is going to look in 10 years' time.
I think that document is going to be one of those things that you look back at and think that was prescient, and we needed to I think we should look into doing that more.
I'm interested.
Yeah, look at it.
I love this when this sort of thing happens. But I do this comes back to something else about, you know, the future, which is I was with a bunch of people yesterday talking about AI, current agentic AI. I have lots of feelings about AI, and talking about open source. And I'm of a generation which slightly rolls my eyes at open source, because I'm like, open source is great, but we did open source for a decade, and then either the good stuff was bought up by people who are not vested in democratic commons, or it didn't work and wasn't supported, and etc. And now I'm having people who are much smarter than me and much younger than me saying, no, but this time round we actually think that open source can really work for these. It's not just a repetition. I think that, and your point about having a constitution of publishing rules and identifying what makes us similar and how we can kind of collectivize around that does feel like one of those ideas that was a bit kind of idealistic or before its time or whatever, but now it's actually just genuinely needed.
Practical frameworks for doing this trade, you know, because there's been so much betrayal of the most simplest values in this industry. But the thing is, if the people don't believe in it, the ethical sort of substrate, like the foundation of it, is flawed, you know, you can't even have it. Like, look what's happening to the Constitution in the United States. It's kind of like the simplest things that are so obvious that are being, like, you know, just sort of like set, it's kerosene and a match, you know. So it's kind of a community-wide decision-making and valuing of things that I think is coming and is sort of snowballing and coming into existence. But it's going to take a long time. And the other key thing is, you know, somebody comes and buys something because they think they make a lot of money, strip it for parts, you know, like what Elon Musk did with Twitter. Like, we have to start thinking that something is a success even if it doesn't make anyone rich.
I think so. I think that point about, I remember when Musk took over Twitter, thinking about it in terms of infrastructure and the idea that if you had physical infrastructure, that somebody did that to civic infrastructure, said, I've bought all the highways in your country and now I'm just going to put potholes in them, or there's certain people will not be able to drive down them in the way that they could, or all those people we banned from driving because they were drunk or they were dangerous, they're going to come back onto the roads because come on down. And we think of speech mechanisms not as infrastructure, but communications infrastructure is infrastructure. I think it's sort of interesting actually as well, Maureen, for the people that you are working with and encouraging, because I've heard from journalists in the United States that the big overlooked community of journalists when big platforms like Twitter essentially fail for the purposes of journalism is actually the kind of the local and the small are the people who benefited most from instant access to experts, being able to make community across space, but because they didn't have the big followings, because they weren't the kind of like famous voices on it, people didn't really sort of focus on that as being a loss. Was it sort of, the platform, we get very platform obsessed in the States. I know the French you built your own internet with Minitel.
That's right. We're really proud of this.
Yeah, exactly. It was great. And now you're laughing now. We're all like, yeah, it was actually a great idea to have your own internet. But I'm just wondering, sort of with those big platform players, how does that feel in Europe now? Are people kind of, do they see them as infrastructures that they can't trust, or that is that an important part of making all of these new networks work?
Actually, yes. It's funny because we just published a piece actually like rethinking the open source or creating like the in-house kind of like CMS or just like publishing tools, because they're starting to realize that with what's happening in the US, infrastructures or tools that we used to use, and we don't even thinking about this, like, it's like social media. We just like, it's something nice, it's great. And now it's not only like, are we going to be like on, I don't know, Instagram, on LinkedIn or Facebook anymore? It's also, are we still like allowed? Like, is it like still like smart to use Google Docs, or is it like great to use like ChatGPT? Like, people are starting to realize that we need to think on the long term, because for now this is still working. But when you're a big independent political newsroom and you're focusing on like a corporation or institutions such like Context in France, like you cannot like trust sometimes the tools you're going to use. So there's like more sometimes it's like independent newsroom that's starting to be like the first people to think about that, but it's already like something that is coming back in France and Europe. And sometimes it can be also more like on an ecological or sustainable like point of view, like because of AI, but also in a way that you want to be coherent, not only like, I don't trust the values, or like I don't respect this kind of platform, so we need to do like our own, or we're going to leave, for example, like Meta and everything. And this coherence like goes also on like in infrastructures, like how tools we're going to use. But also I think right now it's not only for the practical ways, it's also because we don't trust like these platforms anymore. And what's happening right now between like the European Union and like the US, like there's a big fight on privacy and consent. And I know that's always surprised me when I'm here. It's like people like some kind of like marketing teams ask me like how the newsroom are like thriving in Europe, because you need to like ask for the consent of everyone. And like, yeah, like if I want, asking for consent, great. Yeah, that's something that should be like, I don't know, like share like everywhere. And like even like you're not going to like force someone to read your newsletter because you need to ask the consent. So for me, like it's also like we don't know what's going to happen in the near future. So people are starting to build new infrastructure because we don't believe in them anymore, especially the US ones.
This is a paradigm shift that has to happen in so many areas. Like I was at this conference yesterday, and a librarian told me, well, when we tell somebody that a book could go away because we can't afford the license anymore, and they're kind of like, don't understand that this is a dire state of affairs. They're kind of like, it's just like Netflix, or it's just like Spotify, and they're used to it. I'm like, yeah, but they're not going to be used to it if somebody breaks in their house and takes their coffee pot. And that's what's happening. They've paid for the thing, and then they can't have it. And it's sort of like, I just saw this sort of, that's true. Like people don't really, they just get herded into the pen in this sort of unconscious way. And suddenly they realize they're in the pen only later when the guy comes in the door with a sink.
Back to the Elon Musks and his sink. It's. I'm going to ask you both two questions, which is, first of all, I should have done this at the beginning, but actually it's quite fun to do it after we've talked about it for some ways, which is, if you have to define, if Heather was here, she would say, Heather Chaplin, our co-host, define the problem and then describe the best outcome. So like the problem that we have like right now. So Maria, you were saying this actually exists on, there are many different planes of problem, and you were talking about curtailment earlier on. How would you define, is that how you would define the current problem of curtailment? And because I think kind of maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago we'd have said resource or access to resource.
Yeah, I think that's right. Suppression, I would maybe say. Because when something becomes popular or interesting, like you see forces coalescing around it to silence, like particularly free or exciting or interesting or ungovernable voices.
Ungovernable voices. That's what we should call this podcast. Ungovernable voices. So that's your definition of the problem. And what's your best guess? What's your best outcome?
I think that the forces that are trying to shut everything down are sterile. They're not rights originators, they're rights purchasers and exploiters. So the people who originate the rights have got to take back the knife.
Right, how do we do that?
I'm trying.
Build
build
and bring together.
Publish, find the people who want to inform the public in an honest way, put them all in wind them up and let them go and try to raise some money to keep it going. I mean, I really think that sustainability, like if you have enough, I know so many writers, they're not looking to get rich. They make a decent salary, raise their family, just want the basic thing. If you don't have to support the salary of a bunch of billionaires or create all kinds of insane growth or artificial traffic that you buy to start with to make it look like something was, that's not what's necessary. What's needed is enough money to pay the people who are making the thing.
Right, and then you need something to stop anybody else shutting those people down.
Yeah,
which seems so simple when you say it that way.
It's not so difficult as it is. People are so accustomed to the paradigm that my project, it doesn't make very much money. It's small, but it's safe for the moment, and that's the most important thing to me. So, but it looks sort of like, oh, it doesn't count, because it's not this big growing thing. Like, I'm sure you remember a few weeks ago, the publication came out called The Argument. And there's all this money that was millions put into this brand new publication that you never hear a word about. I don't have any idea what they're up to, but it's kind of like they made it look, it's like a Potemkin facade for a thing that there's nothing that, whereas it's possible. I don't know if it will totally succeed, but my sort of approach has been, just plant a seed. It's going to just be a little sprout to start with, eventually a tree.
But also you're a great convener and I hear you're not successful at getting copy out of all of your writers, but most of them. You're pretty good at getting copy out of. We'll leave that there. Maureen, define the problem as we have it right now.
I think the problem right now is that we all think that the real problem is financial, economical independence, and that's the first space. You need that. But I think the awful truth is, even when you financially independent, that's not the end, because you wouldn't have any, you were talking about the Gawker story. For me, it's you can have all the independence in the world, but when you have these kind of people in front of you, you need to have something stronger. And that's why for me, the real thing we need to tackle is how these structures are protected, the cooperative model can be an answer, the part even sometimes it's, you need to think out of the box for the legal framework. That's what Mediapart did. I think it was in 2019. They create this free fund press, and it's nobody can buy Mediapart anymore. And when you say you need to plant a seed, that's exactly what we're trying to do at Médianes, I think for 5 years, because we clearly focus on niche publication and small media. And Mediapart 15 years ago, I think a lot of people were oh yeah, go for it, you'll see. Now it's one of the most prominent publication in France, and it has
awesome.
Now even Nicolas Sarkozy is in prison right now, and I think a lot of people knows that it's partly because Mediapart did this amazing job on investigative journalists, and they were protected in a way, even when the state and some people trying to maybe be in the way. So for me, I think to think about the framework, and you were talking, I think, about infrastructures, I think it's the best way to tackle the problem. It's not only having the money, we need the money, but as you say, I think journalists and media, some of the people, they don't get in this sphere to get rich. We don't do that for that. But
if they did, the vast majority of them would now be very disappointed.
Yes, exactly, right. So for me, it's not, you need that, because if you are not secure, economically secure, you cannot write. But if you have this base, like the second base, like how are you going to protect yourself and the journalist to be able to work not in a nice way, just in a protective way that you doesn't feel like threatened in an everyday basis. So for me, it's like more like on the ownership, how you're going to be really independent. And I think that there's like a great model right now that
it's very pleasing for somebody who spent the vast majority of their working life involved with or working at The Guardian and was told consistently, particularly because I used to cover media business for them in the past, that I've been told by so many people who worked in the city or were VCs, etc. The thing with The Guardian is it doesn't have a business model. And I would say it does have a business model. It just doesn't have a model which is profit driven. We would like to make a profit so we could reinvest it in the business. But it is not. That is not why we get up in the morning. It's like, we have to make sure we don't lose too much money, and we're seeking, and I think it was so difficult in that sort of 10-20 year period for anybody to get their heads around the idea that in fact that model is bad for you at some level if you're doing journalism. I think,
and I think now everyone's looking at The Guardian like, wow, they were like so smart to think this way. And even right now in France, I remember like 5 years ago when we were talking about donation models in France, that was like, we're not the US, like it cannot work here. And now you have like plenty of publications that are like completely funded by the public, for the public, and even like all the news is accessible. You don't need to pay for it. There's even not like a membership thing. Like if you think that this can be like sort of business model, it can actually work. It's just like you have to think about like non-profit news, because again, we don't want to, some kind of the media can be for profit, like when you're B2B like publication, like that you need to have like a super strong paywall, hard paywall to have this. But a lot of news, there's like this democratic value. We need for the people to have access to this kind of news, because if not, like I think it's what's frightening some people in Europe right now, like if everything goes behind a paywall, like we know that it's always going to be the same person that can have the great access to the best news. And especially with AI, like we're going to be like entering like a dark circle if like every great news is behind a paywall. And in some countries you have like great public media, but
if it's intermediated by an AI, it's a different kind of paywall, right?
Exactly.
It's something that you're going through which is enriching a mechanism that is actually not helping.
Exactly.
So I have an interesting thing to share with you that is part of the reason that I came to Boston. There's another aspect of this. You could sell your news to a library and they can own it, and then people could borrow it and look at it. And we're going to do that like soon.
I love that. In France, it's always something that is big, but it's hard sometimes to get in especially like in the public school. But I think it's the best way, because it's a way for like a lot of people to just get access to this news. That's amazing.
And they're also paying. But like the way that I figured out how to do this is through newsletters. In the United States, this is a huge body of very rich journalism information that's just pouring into the commons every day and is not being archived. There's nobody like, Substack or Ghost, they're not bothering it, So these people actually own all their rights, and we can sell a packaged EPUB to a library and they can loan it to their patrons. So you have archiving, you've got a new revenue stream for writers that's direct, and you have like a solution to the problem of like too much closed.
I love that. This is amazing. It's so useful. Actually, it's practical, like things, like to implement.
I think that's maybe a great point to end it, because we've come together with ideas that have made people hopeful, and that was quite an optimistic. Session. So I want to thank both of you for pulling me out of the slough of despond. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that Heather Chaplin is not here. She was, thank you so much, Maureen Doux and Marie Bustillos.
It was
great women.
Thank you.
My pleasure. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I'm really excited to learn more about what you're doing.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you for this great conversation.
We're here to bring people together. This is what we do. Wonderful. Journalism 2050 is a co-production of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism, School, the Columbia Journalism Review, with help from our friends at the Journalism and Design Lab at the New School. Our producer is Amanda Darroch, our production coordinator is Hannah Joy, and our researcher is Sam Earle. Find us wherever you get your podcasts.